I'm here at the Old South Church in Newbury, Massachusetts, and right behind me, underneath this elevated pulpit, are the remains of George Whitefield, the most famous preacher of the Great Awakening. George Whitefield has been called the spiritual father of the spiritual founding father of the United States of America. George Whitefield was British, but he crossed the ocean 13 times, made 7 trips to America, and with a sense of urgency. And he traveled up and down the eastern seaboard from Georgia all the way to Maine. And we're here in Newburyport, just a few miles north of the city of Boston. And this is where George Whitefield, he preached his last sermon, and he was buried here. He died that night of an asthma attack. And George Whitefield was greatly loved by the people who knew him and who followed him, but he was greatly resented by the people who opposed him. If I were to describe George Whitefield, of course he was a graduate of Oxford and he was friends with the Wesley brothers, John and Charles. And if I compared him with John seemed to be very logical and rational. Yes, he had emotions, he had feelings, but George Whitefield seemed to be in the other direction. As I read George Whitefield's sermons and his journal, he seemed to carry his heart on his sleeve, and when he preached, he poured out his heart. And it was not uncommon for him to stop in the middle of his sermon because he couldn't stop weeping. And tremendous crowds came out to hear him preach. Just a few miles south of here on the Boston Common, when the population of Boston was around 17,000, it was estimated that 25,000 people came out on the Boston Common to hear George Whitefield preach. And so as he traveled up and down the eastern seaboard, the Great Awakening exploded. There was already revivals taking place locally and regionally. In Massachusetts with Jonathan Edwards and others, in the middle colonies with people like Gilbert Tennant, and even local revivals in the South. But when George Whitefield came, because he loved to travel, he loved to be on the go, he traveled up and down, and the Great Awakening became one giant inferno of a blazing Great Awakening that actually gave birth to these United States of America. George Whitefield died in 1770. For some time he'd been experiencing weakness in his body. He'd been coughing up blood, but with a sense of urgency he continued his travels. And he preached in this area of Newburyport, Massachusetts, just a few miles north of Boston. And that night he had trouble breathing. He awakened in the night, and he was staying with his friend, the first pastor of this church, Jonathan Parsons, and he was staying in his home. And he awakened in the night. He talked some about, where he was going to spend the winter, if he was going to spend it in this area, or is he going to go back to the south. And then he went back to sleep, but then he awakened again with a tight chest and trouble breathing, and he couldn't breathe. And in spite of, they called in a doctor, George Whitefield breathed his last, I believe, about 6 a.m. that morning. And his funeral was here. One of the people who spoke and prayed at his funeral was an individual named, by the name of, I have his name here, Daniel Rogers, who had been converted under Whitefield's ministry 30 years prior and had been a loyal friend to him all these years. And before he prayed, Daniel Rogers told the people how that he was converted. He said, under the labors of this precious man of God whose remains lie here before us. And then Daniel Rogers began to weep, and he began to cry out, "Oh, my Father, my Father." And the congregation melted into tears. And of course, condolences poured in from throughout America for the loss of George Whitefield. He was the best known figure in colonial America. He was the most recognizable face in colonial America because of his incessant travels up and down the East Coast. And again, he has been called America's spiritual founding father. Benjamin Franklin, who had become a close friend of his. Benjamin Franklin, the skeptical printer in Philadelphia, who 31 years before had become a close friend with Whitefield and had printed and distributed Whitefield's sermons and had been a friend and business advisor with Whitefield. He was in London at the time. And this is what Benjamin Franklin wrote when he heard of his friend's passing. He said, "I knew him intimately upwards of 30 years. His integrity, disinterestedness, and in other words, his unending zeal in prosecuting every good work I have never seen equaled. I shall never see exceeded." Benjamin Franklin, by the way, was never the same as a result of his personal friendship with George Whitefield. And so as we stand here, we're reminded how that our country, how America was birthed out of a great spiritual awakening with men and women like George Whitefield totally sold out to Jesus, totally consecrated and dedicated to his work. And America is in need of a new birth, of another great awakening. And it will only come forth as God finds men and women, the George Whitefields of this generation, who will give themselves completely to God to advance his kingdom. Not to build our own kingdoms, but to advance his kingdom. And to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth, in America, on earth as in heaven." God bless you. I'm Eddie Hyatt, here at the Old South Church in Newbury, Massachusetts. Behind me is the tomb of George Whitefield, the most famous preacher of the Great Awakening.